I still remember the early days of my life as if they were etched in stone, a time when every moment felt like an endless trial. I grew up in a household that was far from warm or welcoming. From the very beginning, it seemed as though I was trapped in a cage of expectations and control. My mother, a woman who demanded perfection in every possible way, never hesitated to impose her will on me. Every action, every word, was scrutinized as if I were a constant project in need of fixing. I was the youngest in a family dominated by two older sisters who seemed to embody her ideals, leaving little room for me to breathe. Their presence was a constant reminder that I was never quite good enough. They towered over me in every sense, both literally and metaphorically, and I often felt invisible beside them, a shadow in their dazzling, well-ordered world. Their criticisms, subtle yet piercing, made it clear that I was always in the back seat of their priorities. When I was 7, the final blow came unexpectedly. My father, whose presence had been a faint memory even before that, walked out of our lives without so much as a backward glance. His departure left a void that no amount of forced affection could ever fill. I had longed for a father's love, a protection, or even just the reassurance of his existence. But all I got was silence and the echo of an empty home. That moment sealed my fate in a way I couldn't fully comprehend at the time, marking the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward understanding who I was meant to be. School wasn't much of an escape either. Instead of finding solace among friends, I became the target of relentless bullying. The taunts and jeers were a daily assault, a cruel reminder that the world outside was just as unforgiving as the one inside my home. I would walk into the classroom with a heavy heart, the weight of every sneer and every whispered remark dragging me down. The halls became a labyrinth of shadows where I was constantly on guard, never knowing when the next wave of cruelty would hit. In those early years, love, at least the kind that I desperately craved, seemed like a myth, a story told in whispers that wasn't meant for someone like me. My mother's love was conditional and fleeting, available only when I conformed to her stringent demands. I was made to feel that my very existence was a series of failures, each misstep a personal affront to her strict expectations. I learned quickly that emotions were dangerous here, that showing vulnerability only invited more control and more criticism. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed me, I couldn't help but wonder about the kind of person I might have been under different circumstances. I would lie awake, imagining a world where kindness wasn't rationed out as a luxury, where a warm smile or a gentle word could heal the wounds inflicted by daily life. Those thoughts were my secret rebellion, a tiny spark of hope in an otherwise dark and oppressive reality. The chaos of my early years didn't just shape my outward behavior. It seeped into every corner of my soul. I became acutely aware of every slight, every gesture of indifference. The absence of a protective, nurturing presence forced me to develop a hard shell around my heart. I learned to hide my pain behind a facade of indifference, convincing myself that if I didn't care, then maybe I wouldn't be hurt so deeply. It was a lonely strategy, but it was the only one I knew. As I grew older, the scars of that turbulent childhood became a part of me, both a curse and a strange kind of armor. They reminded me of the battles I'd fought, of the times I'd been knocked down, but somehow managed to stand back up again. And even though those early experiences left me with a lingering sense of abandonment and self-doubt, they also ignited a quiet determination to break free from the cycle of pain. Looking back now, I can see how every harsh word, every act of cruelty, was a piece of a puzzle that would eventually force me to confront the darkest parts of myself. The lessons were harsh, often painful, but they planted the seeds of resilience. I began to realize that the person who had been so mercilessly controlled was not defined by that control. Instead, I started to see the beginnings of a different story, one where I could reclaim my own narrative, where the ghosts of my past might one day be transformed into the fuel for something greater. It wasn't easy to accept the truth about my early life. The memories were like open wounds, raw and unhealed, and each recollection threatened to pull me back into that place of helplessness. But with every memory, I also gathered a piece of strength, a resolve that whispered there was more to life than the misery of those formative years. I began to understand that while the past could never be rewritten, the future was a canvas waiting for my own, unfiltered brushstrokes. The journey from that troubled childhood to the person I am today has been a long and winding road, a road marked by moments of both despair and defiant hope. And though the shadows of my early life may never fully disappear, I have learned to live with them, to acknowledge them as part of the tapestry of my existence. It is through this acceptance that I've begun to forge a path toward a future defined not by my scars, but by the strength they've given me. I still remember the crisp autumn air of that first fall at the University of Chicago in 1998. It was a time of new beginnings and unexpected encounters, a stark contrast to the shadows of my past. I had entered the campus with a quiet sense of trepidation, unsure of what to expect from this new chapter of my life. Amid the sea of unfamiliar faces, there was one that stood out almost immediately. Her name was Rachel. From the moment I first saw her, it was as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis. She exuded a confidence that was both captivating and intimidating, a stark contrast to my own reserved nature. Rachel was effortlessly attractive, not just in the way she carried herself, but in the aura of self-assurance that surrounded her. While I lingered in the background, almost invisible, she moved through life like a bright comet, drawing attention and admiration wherever she went. I was drawn to her, and though my shyness held me back at first, fate seemed determined to push us together. Our paths crossed during a group project in one of our early classes. I remember fumbling through my words, trying desperately not to stumble over my own insecurities as we discussed the project's details. Yet, in her presence, something shifted. She listened intently, occasionally offering a laugh that made my heart skip a beat. Her warmth, despite the rumors that swirled around her, was undeniable. It wasn't long before we found ourselves spending more time together, away from the pressure of academic expectations. I was acutely aware of the whispers that trailed behind her, hints and half-truths about past infidelities and the complexity of her relationships. In a world where trust was a rare currency, those stories could have easily deterred me. But as I got to know her, I realized that life was seldom black and white. Rachel was multifaceted, full of contradictions and surprises that made her all the more intriguing. Our early dates were a mix of hesitant exploration and bold adventures. I found myself opening up in ways I never had before. Conversations with her were like peeling back layers of my own guarded heart. There was an honesty in her eyes, a vulnerability beneath the confident exterior that resonated with the longings I had buried deep within. Despite the rumors, there was a genuine connection forming between us, a spark that defied the cautionary tales whispered by others. Each moment with her was a lesson in living without the constant fear of judgment. I learned to let my guard down, to trust even when the scars of my past urged me to retreat. And while there were nights when doubt crept in, when the stories about her past behavior seemed too real to ignore, I chose to see her for who she was in those fleeting, honest moments we shared. There was an unspoken promise in her smile, a suggestion that perhaps we were both seeking something more profound than the roles that the world had cast for us. Our relationship, with all its complexities and uncertainties, became a refuge from the relentless pressures of our individual histories. In Rachel, I discovered a kind of freedom I had never known, a freedom to be imperfect, to stumble and rise again. And even as I grappled with the duality of her reputation and the undeniable allure of her presence, I found solace in the fact that love, in its truest form, often defies easy explanations. Looking back, meeting Rachel was a turning point, a moment when the cold, calculated world of my past collided with the unpredictable warmth of human connection. In her, I saw not just the promise of a romantic liaison, but the possibility of healing old wounds, of finding a light in the darkness that had once seemed impenetrable. It was a leap of faith, one that carried the risk of heartbreak and betrayal, Yet it was also a leap towards something infinitely more vital, the hope of rediscovering myself through the eyes of someone who dared to love me despite all my imperfections. I still remember the whirlwind of emotions that swept through my life when Rachel and I decided to take the plunge. Marriage, I soon learned, was as much about the unspoken understandings as it was about the shared dreams. In the years that followed, our love story took on the guise of a well-rehearsed dance, one where I was often leading, my steps guided by the desire to build a future that had eluded me in my childhood. Our union was punctuated by the arrival of two beautiful daughters, Laura and Brooke, whose very presence breathed life into our once muted home. As I poured every ounce of energy into building my career, Rachel seemed to embrace a role that was both enviable and confounding. With an effortless charm, she basked in the glow of being my wife, drawing admirers and onlookers who marveled at our picture-perfect family. I often found myself caught between pride and a creeping sense of isolation. While I was busy scaling professional heights, she reveled in the social accolades that came with our union, a balance that at first felt perfectly aligned. But as the years rolled on, a subtle tension began to weave its way into our carefully constructed life. It was in 2012 that the first whispers of doubt began to echo in the quiet corners of my mind. I started noticing small inconsistencies, a missed phone call here, a vague excuse there, that collectively painted a picture too elusive to fully grasp. The suspicion that perhaps Rachel might be straying from the path we had so deliberately chosen clawed at me. It wasn't a conviction born of evidence, but rather a slow, unsettling feeling that something was amiss. Every time I tried to confront the notion, the truth slipped away like a shadow at dusk. I'd search for proof, little breadcrumbs that might confirm my fears, but each time I was met with silence or a half-hearted explanation that did little to settle the storm raging inside me. There were nights when I lay awake, the weight of my uncertainty pressing down on me like a relentless tide. I questioned whether I was simply overthinking, haunted by the ghosts of my troubled past, or if this was a genuine betrayal festering beneath the surface of our seemingly idyllic life. The duality of our existence, my steadfast pursuit of professional success and her effortless embrace of a life filled with social admiration, began to erode the fragile trust we had built over the years. I was torn between the desire to confront her and the paralyzing fear of what that confrontation might unleash. Amid the chaos of my inner turmoil, the innocence of our daughters served as both a reminder of what we had built together and a stark contrast to the growing darkness in our marital life. Yet, even as suspicion festered, the love that had once bound us seemed to hold a fragile promise of redemption. In those rare, quiet moments, when the world around us fell away, we would catch glimpses of the connection that had first drawn us together. A shared smile, a tender look, or even the soft murmur of reassurance would momentarily dispel the shadows of doubt. But the unsettling question lingered like an uninvited guest at our dinner table. Was our love strong enough to withstand the whispers of infidelity? Looking back, that period in our marriage was a crucible, a time when every laugh, every tear, every hushed conversation carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. The duality of our roles, me, the diligent provider, and her, the enchanting socialite, had given rise to an unexpected vulnerability. And while I never uncovered the evidence that might have made everything clear, the suspicion left an indelible mark on my soul, a twist in our narrative that would forever alter the course of our family life. In retrospect, the absence of concrete proof was as painful as it was liberating. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most profound betrayals are not always measured in acts, but in the slow, insidious erosion of trust. And as I navigated the treacherous waters of suspicion and doubt, I began to realize that the story of our marriage was far more complex than a simple tale of love and infidelity. It was a testament to the fragility of human connection and the resilience required to forge ahead in spite of the unseen fractures beneath the surface. I can still remember the day the truth shattered the fragile veneer of our life together. It was a quiet, overcast afternoon, not unlike many others since our youngest had left for university. but something felt different. I was alone in the study, the silence of the house weighing heavily on me, when Laura approached hesitantly. Her eyes, usually so composed, were brimming with a storm of conflicting emotions. I could tell from the tremor in her voice that what she was about to say would change everything. She took a deep breath and, with a pained expression, revealed that our lives were built on a lie. Laura confessed that she had discovered undeniable proof of her mother's betrayal. I felt as if the floor had given way beneath me. The name that cut through the revelation like a hot knife was Oliver Johnson. My colleague, someone I had come to respect, someone who had shared countless late nights at the office, and whose trust one had never questioned. To learn that he was entwined in a secret liaison with Rachel was a betrayal so profound it sent shockwaves through every fiber of my being. I remember how my heart pounded and my mind raced with a tumult of emotions. Anger, disbelief, despair. In that moment, everything I had ever believed about our marriage, the years of shared memories, the life we had built together, crashed down around me. It wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a breach of trust in every sense of the word. I felt as though my entire world was being dismantled piece by piece, leaving me exposed and utterly vulnerable. Determined to confront the situation head-on, I arranged for a quiet evening at home, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. When the time came, I looked at Rachel with a mixture of pain and resolve. The air between us was thick with unspoken words and the heavy anticipation of what was to come. I asked her directly, my voice trembling yet firm, to explain the shocking revelation that had been laid bare by our daughter. I needed to hear her side of the story, however bitter it might be. What followed was a conversation that I will never forget, a conversation that stripped away every pretense and left us raw and exposed. Rachel's reaction was both startling and brutally honest. Without a trace of remorse, she admitted to the affair with Oliver Johnson. I watched in disbelieving silence as she explained her actions with an almost clinical detachment. It was only the body, she said coolly, her eyes devoid of the emotion I had expected, not the heart or the mind. Her words, so blunt and dismissive, cut through me with the precision of a scalpel. In that moment, it was clear that the physical betrayal was all she cared to acknowledge. What stung even more than the admission itself was the way Rachel framed our entire marriage. In her eyes, I was the weak one, an appendage to her life rather than an equal partner. She made no effort to hide the belief that she was the true driving force behind our union, the one who held the power and control. I had always assumed that a marriage was built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice, but here she was, unapologetically asserting her dominance. Her nonchalance in the face of such a profound betrayal left me feeling belittled and emasculated, as if all the years I had spent striving to be a worthy husband had been rendered meaningless by her cold, calculated confession. I found myself grappling with a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was an overwhelming sense of betrayal that threatened to drown me. On the other, a deep, painful realization that perhaps I had been complicit in my own subjugation all along. The dynamic in our marriage, long skewed in favor of Rachel's needs and desires, now seemed even more damning. Her willingness to reduce our relationship to a mere physical transaction revealed a truth that I had long avoided. I had allowed myself to be diminished, to be treated as if my contributions were negligible compared to hers. In the aftermath of her confession, the silence that fell over our home was deafening. Every room, every piece of furniture, seemed to hold memories of a time when I believed in us, when I trusted that love was enough to bridge any gap. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of her words settle like a shroud around me, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The betrayal was not just a breach of trust. It was an irrevocable rupture in the very foundation of our life together. I spent many sleepless nights in the following days, replaying every conversation, every gesture, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything began to fall apart. I questioned my own worth and the choices that had led me to this point. How could I have been so blind? How had I allowed myself to be reduced to a passive observer in the story of our marriage? The answers eluded me, buried under layers of regret and sorrow. Yet, amidst the pain and confusion, one thing was painfully clear. The betrayal had irrevocably altered the course of my life. It was a turning point, a moment of harsh awakening that forced me to confront the reality of who we had become. Rachel's shameless confession, her belief in her own superiority and my supposed weakness, would haunt me for years to come. And as I sat in the quiet aftermath, I knew that the journey ahead would be one of introspection, healing, and perhaps, in time, a redefinition of what it meant to be truly strong. In the days following that shattering revelation, I found myself teetering on the edge of a decision that would forever alter my course. The betrayal had ignited in me a fierce, burning need not only to reclaim my dignity, but also to exact a measure of retribution that had been long overdue. It wasn't enough to simply endure the collapse of a once-cherished marriage. I had to take control of my life, piece by piece, no matter how painful the process might be. Late at night, when the world around me was shrouded in darkness and silence, I began to meticulously plan my escape. I started by opening a secret bank account, a quiet repository for the funds that I would claim as my own. With calculated precision, I transferred $150,000, a sum that I had painstakingly amassed over years of honest work and sacrifice, from our shared accounts into this hidden reserve. Every digit I moved felt like reclaiming a stolen fragment of my identity. I wasn't just moving money. I was gathering evidence of my worth, safeguarding what remained of my future from the wreckage of our crumbling marriage. I wasn't done yet. With a cold clarity that belied the storm raging inside me, I made sure to erase any trace of my financial involvement in our shared accounts. I meticulously deleted records and backed up data that could later be used against me. It was a painful process, each click of the delete button a final farewell to a chapter of my life that had been marred by deception. I wanted nothing left that would tie me down to a life I was eager to leave behind. The next step in my plan was even more drastic. I had long felt stifled by the very job that had once represented hope and stability, a job that in retrospect had become yet another arena for manipulation and control. But before I could sever that tie, I had to ensure that I wouldn't walk away empty-handed. Over the course of several nights, I gathered company data that painted a damning picture of the corruption and cover-ups that had been quietly festering in the corridors of power. With the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose, I uploaded that information to the management secure server. Every file, every damning piece of evidence, was a calculated blow against the establishment that had once taken me for granted. It was a leap into the unknown, but it was also my way of ensuring that I left behind a legacy of truth, a final act of defiance against a world that had repeatedly betrayed me. As I prepared to walk away from the professional life that had both sustained and suffocated me, I found myself compelled to uncover more truths about my own past. The betrayal I experienced with Rachel had long been intertwined with the secrets and half-truths of my childhood. In a moment of desperate clarity, I reached out to the few paternal relatives I had barely known, seeking answers to questions that had gnawed at me for years. Their initial hesitance gave way to reluctant honesty, and what I learned shattered another part of my fragile identity. It turned out that the narrative I had been fed about my parents' divorce was a carefully constructed lie. My mother, the very person who had dominated my early years with her iron will and unyielding control, had deliberately obscured the true reasons behind the dissolution of my parents' marriage. The painful truth, as I pieced it together from whispered family recollections and old documents, was that there was more to the story than I had ever been allowed to know. The real catalyst for their split was not the failure of my father alone, but a tapestry of deceit and unfulfilled promises, a betrayal that echoed the infidelities I was now experiencing firsthand. The realization that my mother had not been the innocent victim of circumstance, as I had always believed, but had instead woven a narrative that suited her own needs, was both liberating and devastating. Each revelation, each carefully executed act of defiance, was a step further away from the life I had known, a life marred by lies, betrayal, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness. I had transformed my sorrow into a weapon, using every secret, every bit of stolen truth, as ammunition against the forces that had robbed me of my sense of self. The clandestine bank account and the incriminating files were not just tools for my revenge. They were symbols of my determination to reclaim every ounce of dignity that had been stripped away over the years. Now, standing on the precipice of divorce, I felt an odd mixture of relief and anticipation. The weight of the past was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a steely resolve to rebuild my life on my own terms. In the midst of chaos, I had discovered a raw, unyielding strength, a strength that would carry me through the next chapter, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. The plans I had set in motion were irreversible, each decision a deliberate step towards liberation and, ultimately, redemption. The day everything finally fell into place arrived with an unexpected clarity. I had spent weeks orchestrating each detail of my plan, and now it was time to pull the trigger on the last, decisive acts that would sever every tie to the life I once knew. I remember waking up with a sense of grim determination, the early morning light filtering through my window like a premonition of what was to come. The first move was to liquidate the asset that had been both a home and a monument to shared memories, a house that had seen too many silent dinners and unspoken resentments. I listed it discreetly and soon found a buyer willing to pay $1,150,000. The sale was swift, almost clinical in its execution. I watched as the house, with all its accumulated histories and secrets, transformed into nothing more than cold, hard cash. That money was not just a financial windfall. It was a symbol of reclaiming control over my destiny. With the house sold, I turned my attention to dismantling the joint financial entanglements that had once bound us together. One by one, I closed all our joint accounts, severing the last of the financial lifelines that had sustained our marriage. I methodically canceled every cell phone and utility contract that still bore our shared names. Each cancellation was a small but significant act of liberation, a final declaration that I was no longer willing to play by the rules of a union that had betrayed me. Then there was the matter of Rachel's prized possession, a sleek car that she cherished, a tangible extension of her identity and independence. I arranged for a discreet trade of the car for cash. It wasn't an act of petty revenge. Rather, it was a calculated move to leave her with nothing. By stripping away her financial security in such a definitive manner, I was not only reclaiming what I had lost, but also ensuring that she would face the consequences of her choices without the cushion of shared resources. Yet, it wasn't only about financial liberation. I felt the need to obliterate every reminder of the life we had built together, a life that now existed only as a painful memory. I ventured out into the garden, where, hidden among overgrown ivy and the neglected blooms of what once might have been a symbol of our love, lay artifacts of a bygone era. Among these, the wedding dress stood out in its symbolic cruelty, a garment that had once promised eternal commitment, now a relic of deceit. With a heavy heart and a fierce resolve, I set the dress and other mementos ablaze. I watched as the flames consumed the fabric, turning them to ash in a final, cathartic act of release. The garden, once a quiet witness to happier times, now bore the marks of my defiance. Its shard remains a testament to the end of an era. Each step I took was imbued with a paradoxical mix of sorrow and liberation. I wasn't celebrating a victory over Rachel, as much as I was reclaiming the parts of myself that had been eroded over years of manipulation and neglect. The financial maneuvers were a means to an end, a way to ensure that I would walk away with my dignity intact and the possibility of a future unburdened by the weight of betrayal. As the day wore on, I realized that I had not only dismantled the tangible ties to my past, but had also begun to untangle the emotional knots that had held me captive for so long. Every contract terminated, every account closed, and every item reduced to ash was a deliberate step away from the life I had once been forced to endure. In those final moments, I felt a profound sense of transformation, a rebirth of sorts. The plan was no longer just an act of revenge. It had become a statement of self-respect, a quiet assertion that I was more than the sum of my betrayals and heartaches. With the preparations complete, I took one last, lingering look at the remnants of our former life. There was no dramatic farewell, no grand ceremony of closure, just the silent satisfaction of knowing that the chains had been broken. I walked away from the house that had once been our home, from the memories that haunted every corner, and stepped into an uncertain future that, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged solely to me. In the aftermath of that day, as I settled into the solitary rhythm of my new existence, I carried with me the bittersweet knowledge that while revenge could never truly erase the past, it could pave the way for a future defined by strength and autonomy. Each act, each deliberate decision, was a brick in the foundation of a life rebuilt on my own terms, free from the lies, the betrayals, and the shadows that had once threatened to consume me. In the weeks and months following the final severance of ties, I set about forging a new life, one that I hoped would mend the wounds of betrayal and rebuild the shattered remnants of my identity. The first step was to secure a fresh start, both professionally and personally. I landed a new job that not only provided a sense of renewed purpose, but also offered the flexibility to be closer to my daughters. Finding an apartment in a neighborhood that felt welcoming and safe was a small victory in itself. I envisioned a home where laughter could eventually replace the echoes of past sorrows, and where I could be a steady presence in Laura's and Brooke's lives, reassuring them that even after the darkest storms, light could still break through. Yet, the need for closure, and perhaps a twisted sense of justice, drove me to take further steps against those who had contributed to my downfall. The evidence I had painstakingly gathered during my years of silent suffering and calculated preparation became the cornerstone of my next act of retribution. With a measured resolve, I began to exploit the very data that once symbolized my vulnerability. I initiated a series of financial maneuvers designed to inflict a significant blow to Oliver Johnson's company, the same company that had unwittingly served as the backdrop to my personal betrayal. The files, replete with incriminating details and damning evidence, were not simply handed over to authorities. I strategically leaked them to key stakeholders within the organization. The fallout was swift and brutal. Johnson's company, once a symbol of stability and success, found itself entangled in a web of legal scrutiny and public scandal. It was a calculated risk, but the chaos that ensued was a bitter, if necessary, consolation for the years of manipulation and deceit. As if that weren't enough, I couldn't ignore the opportunity to target another pillar of my old life, the management from my former job, and in particular my old boss, whose own indiscretions had been as toxic as they were hidden. In a moment of resolute defiance, I compiled a dossier containing compromising information about him and his secret liaison with his mistress. It wasn't an act of petty vindictiveness. It was a deliberate decision to expose the hypocrisy and corruption that had flourished in an environment that once celebrated loyalty and professionalism. With careful deliberation, I sent the damning details to several of his relatives, people I knew would appreciate the truth behind the carefully curated public facade he maintained. The scandal that followed was both swift and relentless. Family secrets, long buried under the weight of social propriety, began to surface, eroding the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. In the ensuing chaos, the once untouchable man was reduced to a cautionary tale, a living example of how the sins of the past could come back to claim their due. Navigating the aftermath of these revelations was a complex dance of emotions. Each day presented new challenges and unexpected twists that forced me to confront the reality of what I had become. I was no longer the man who had passively endured abuse and betrayal. I had transformed into someone unrecognizable in the mirror, a man driven by a fierce desire for retribution and the need to reclaim his agency. There were nights when the thrill of my actions was tempered by a quiet melancholy, a recognition that revenge, however satisfying in the moment, was a double-edged sword that could consume you if you let it. Still, every victory, every carefully executed move, was a step away from the powerless version of myself that had once cowered under the weight of manipulation. The new job provided not only a financial lifeline, but also an avenue for personal growth. I found solace in the rhythm of my work, in the camaraderie of colleagues who respected my expertise, and in the simple pleasure of knowing that I was finally charting a course that belonged solely to me. My apartment, modest yet imbued with a sense of new beginnings, became a sanctuary where I could start to piece together a future unburdened by the ghosts of my past. In this new chapter, the data I had used to dismantle the lives of those who had wronged me was a constant reminder that I had the power to shape my destiny, even if it came at a cost. With each act of exposure and each financial blow delivered, I felt a piece of the old weight lift from my shoulders. It was a process marked by cautious optimism and hard-won moments of clarity, a journey toward a life defined not by the betrayals of yesterday, but by the resilience and resolve of the man I was becoming. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without its lingering doubts and scars. But as I settled into my new routine, balancing a promising career, the responsibilities of fatherhood, and the ongoing fallout of my carefully orchestrated moves, I began to understand that true liberation was not found solely in the act of revenge. It was discovered in the quiet moments of introspection, in the determination to rise above the pain, and in the unwavering commitment to rebuild a life that was authentically my own. I never imagined that one day I'd be face to face with Rachel again in such a raw, unexpected way. It was a busy afternoon at work, a day filled with routine tasks and the steady hum of productivity, when I heard someone calling my name in the lobby. I stepped away from my desk, curiosity mingling with a wary anticipation that I couldn't quite shake off. There, leaning hesitantly against the reception desk, was Rachel. The sight of her, worn down by desperation and regret, struck me with a cold clarity that no amount of time could ever erase. Her eyes, once so full of unbridled confidence, now darted around nervously as if seeking solace in the familiar hum of the office environment. She looked smaller, diminished by the weight of her own mistakes and the stark realization of what she had lost. The desperation in her gaze was unmistakable, a silent plea for reconciliation that I had long since ceased to offer. It was as if every moment of her life since our separation had led to this one final, futile attempt at redemption. "Nick," she began, her voice tentative and unsteady. She hesitated, the words caught in her throat. There was a raw vulnerability in her tone that I hadn't seen before, a stark contrast to the woman who had once wielded control over our lives with such arrogance. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, a reminder of the man who once loved her despite everything. But that feeling was quickly drowned out by the long, bitter journey that had brought me to this point, a journey defined by betrayal, pain, and a relentless pursuit of justice. I took a steadying breath and met her gaze with a calm that belied the turbulent emotions swirling inside me. "Rachel," I said, my voice measured and resolute, "this isn't the time or place for old regrets." I could see that she was trying to gauge if there was any room for a return to what we once had, any chance to erase the past mistakes and start anew. But the woman before me had become an echo of what I once knew, a relic of a life that had crumbled under the weight of greed and betrayal. I motioned for her to join me in my office, a neutral, quiet space away from prying eyes and the buzz of everyday work. Once seated across from each other, the silence between us was heavy with unspoken truths. I could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope that perhaps we could somehow mend the shattered pieces of our past. But I knew too well that our history was too irreparably damaged, and that any attempt at reconciliation would only serve to reopen old wounds. "I've made my decisions, Rachel," I said quietly, my tone final and unyielding. "There's no going back to what we had. You left me with no other choice." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of anger, regret, and something akin to fear. I continued, "I'm prepared to settle everything once and for all. I can offer you $100,000 if you'll sign the divorce papers today. That's it. No more drama, no more hidden secrets, just a clean break. The offer hung in the air, stark and uncompromising, as if it were the only logical conclusion to our disastrous union. For a long moment, Rachel sat in silence, her mind visibly racing through a torrent of conflicting emotions. I could almost see the realization dawning on her, that her own actions had not only led to this irrevocable severance, but had also cost her everything. The more she thought about it, the more the weight of her own betrayal seemed to settle upon her shoulders. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke. I understand, Nick. I never wanted it to come to this, but I see now that I've lost more than I ever cared to admit. I was so caught up in my own pride, my own need for control, that I never considered the cost. I never truly valued what we had until I lost it all. Her admission, laced with a bitter self-awareness, was both a confession and a resignation, a silent acknowledgement that her greed had been her downfall. I watched her struggle with the finality of our situation, each word she uttered stripping away any lingering illusions of reconciliation. In that moment, I realized that our relationship had been reduced to a mere transaction, a bitter exchange of money for the dissolution of a shared past. The $100,000 wasn't just a settlement. It was a symbol of the closure I desperately needed, a way to sever the last ties that bound me to a life filled with deceit and unending heartache. With a final, shaky breath, Rachel nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll sign." The words, though simple, marked the end of an era defined by betrayal, manipulation, and lost opportunities. As she reached for the pen and the divorce papers lay before us, I felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. The pages, once filled with the promises of a future together, were now just a formal acknowledgement of everything that had gone terribly wrong. As I watched her sign her name, sealing her fate and the end of our tumultuous journey, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of finality. Rachel's desperate attempt to come back, to reclaim something that was already lost, was met with the cold, unyielding reality of her own choices. In that last, fleeting moment of shared silence, it became clear that she had lost not only the marriage, but also the very essence of what she once was, consumed by greed and betrayal, stripped of any true redemption. When she left my office that day, it wasn't with the triumphant stride of someone reclaiming lost love, but with the defeated slouch of a person who had finally understood that some doors, once closed, can never be reopened. And as I sat alone in the quiet aftermath, I knew that I, too, was beginning to heal, one final, irrevocable step toward a future free of the ghosts of our past.